Good morning, Erin. How are you?
Good morning. I'm great. How are you?
Yeah, really good, really good. Well, it's nice to have a sunny Portland connected to a sunny London. That's probably a rare occurrence when we get both, but yeah,
Yeah, I think it's the perfect setting for this discussion.
sounds good. Sounds good. Well, it's a pleasure to talk to you because I've followed your work for a while, so it's great to get the chance to have a conversation. And it's an honour as well to have you as a subscriber and a listener and a watcher to some of the conversations I've done so far. So you know this already, but it's a series of conversations about what I think of as the two deepest philosophical questions: what's real and what and who matters. And I have a clear agenda here, which I'm not hiding, given the name of the podcast, because I'm trying to popularize and develop this really simple pluralistic worldview called Sentientism, which says that when it comes to thinking about what's real and what to believe, we should take a naturalistic approach using evidence and reason. And when it comes to who and what matters, the clue is in the name. We should have moral consideration and compassion for every sentient being, so any being that has the capacity to suffer or flourish in simple terms. But I have the privilege of talking in these conversations to an amazing, diverse range of minds, some of whom agree with sentientism and some of whom don't. So it will be great to explore your own philosophical journey and see what you think of the idea and how well it matches to yours. But before we get into those big questions, how would you best introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Erin Wing. I am the Deputy Director of Investigations at Animal Outlook, which is a national nonprofit animal advocacy organization dedicated to ending the exploitation of farmed animals in the United States. So I was also a undercover investigator for about 2 years before I stepped into this role that I'm in currently. And during the course of those 2 years, I conducted four different undercover investigations into a couple of different sectors in the animal agriculture industry.
Yeah, thank you. And your insights are, I'm not sure it's possible to summarize them, but a combination of shock and awe. And I have deep respect for what you've done. But again, we'll dig back into that later in the conversation when we come to talk about the future and driving change. And I think you have a particularly unique insight into the nature of the animal industry. So yeah, it would be good to dig into that. But before we come on to those questions, let's go to these philosophical foundations, if you like. So the first question really is what's real? So for many of my guests, that's a story about whether they grew up in a more religious or supernatural or mystical context in terms of family and society, or one that was maybe more scientifically minded, more naturalistic, and how their philosophy has changed over time, if it has. So yeah, it'd be fascinating to know your story on epistemology, really, and how you think about the universe and reality and what to believe.
Right. Well, I was brought up very religious, Christian, and I think that is sort of the more normal, expected background for any individual who's a person of color who is growing up in this country, where they're normally, most of the time, you'll grow up in a family that is sort of Christian, religious, go to church every Sunday, that type of thing. So
Yeah,
when I was younger, that was my mindset, and that was how I set sort of my moral standards based on what was in the Bible, what was in that book, and what was taught in churches when I went on Sundays with my family, and then whatever moral teachings I received from my parents were directly pulled from those sources.
yeah,
So that was how I formed that sort of idea of the way that I should walk through this world and the way that I should treat others, and having that ultimate goal of if you do all these things, and was that the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you.
yeah.
That was something that I actually really identified and connected with. And that was something I latched onto, and that sort of informed, and I think was like a teaser for the mindset I would end up developing now.
Yeah.
So
And
when I was,
what variety of Christianity was it?
I'm not that familiar with the specifics. I just know Christian, just go to church every Sunday, that type of thing, wear your Sunday best. That was how I grew up. So I'm not entirely familiar with the specifics, unfortunately.
Yeah, yeah, no problem. And so you've already talked about how that, if you like, set the seed and the grounding for some of your moral thinking, which is we'll come on to in the second question as well. How did you feel about the belief aspects of that as well? Did that feel like an important part of the community and the belief system? Was the belief in a deity and the other things that come with that, and or was it more focused on the moral side that you felt the influence?
I felt the influence definitely from the moral side, simply because I was more invested and interested in the aspects of religion that influence people to be good to others
Yeah.
in a variety of different ways. I think was definitely a point in my life where I started to question uh, whether that was as effective to sort of base the way that you treat others on standards that are established within that religious context, because there always seem to be some exclusions. There always
Yeah.
seem to be some conditions. And for me, I just liked the simplicity of that golden rule: do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And others encompassed everyone, whether they be humans, whether they be animals or children, women, men, everyone, regardless of what their sexuality might be, their backgrounds, or whatever they identified as, etc. It just I just took it as
Yeah.
others meaning everyone.
Yeah.
So
So you
that
like the
was where
golden rule, but without exceptions. Yeah.
that was where I most, connected to.
Yeah. And have you maintained the that Christianity through your life? Would you describe yourself as a Christian now? Do you?
No, I wouldn't. I
Yeah.
would just describe myself as someone who just wants to make the world a better place for everyone in it.
Yeah. And was that a conscious decision to, if you like, leave Christianity, or is it just something that's faded away a little bit, or how's that transition, that process worked? Because for some people, it is just a fading. It's almost unremarkable. For other people, it can be quite a traumatic thing to work through psychologically, socially, difficulties with family and so on. Was that how did that process work for you?
Yes, well, it's interesting, and it's a really great question because I haven't really actually thought about it.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to know that for some people it has been different. And I think maybe a little bit of both, but more so the just sort of gradual fading. And that was something that was sort of natural as I got older. I started questioning things more. And I remember I would have so many, not arguments, but really lively discussions with my mother, who is very much religious. And I would just ask these questions about, well, there's the Old Testament, there's the New Testament. Well, why is there a New Testament if the word of God is supposed to be like set in stone, absolutely right, no like wrongs there? And then we would just go back and forth on that.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it was always something where she encouraged me to ask these questions, and we would have these sort of, I would make jokes, and then she would, laugh about it too. And it was never something where I wasn't allowed to ask questions. And I think that was what ended up making sort of a household that was sort of more open to me expressing myself in a variety of different ways and coming to my own conclusions, which I'm grateful for.
Yeah. Yeah. That's impressive. So even though it was deeply important for her and she was totally convinced, she still gave you that space to ask the questions and would engage with you about it. And one of the other things I find interesting, when quite a few of my guests have a religious worldview, most of them are sort of naturalistic, maybe atheist or agnostic, but some of them have a religious worldview. And I find it interesting, what's the basis for that? So practically, for most of them, it's just because that's what they grew up with. That it's quite rare that people actually choose a religion. Normally, it's just, well, that's what my parents told me, and that's what the community defined as a default. So I never chose it. I just grew up in it. But then as people think things through, there's at least a couple of paths. One is they say, well, this is an article of faith for me. I choose to believe it. I'm not really that interested in whether there's a rationale or logic or evidence for this thing. It's faith, and there's some pride in that as well. It's almost an independent commitment, if you like. Whereas for other people, they will say, well, no, Jamie, actually, I'm a naturalist too. I use evidence and reason to work out what to believe, and it's led me to believe that there is a deity and Jesus Christ was his son and that the Bible is the word of God. And so do you get a sense from your conversations with your mum about whether she was it's just faith, or whether she thought it was actually a logical, set of things to believe?
Yes, definitely for her, it was faith-based.
Yeah.
So she just had to believe, and that is what keeps her going. I remember having a conversation with someone who was also not religious at some point in my life later on, maybe 4, 5, 6 years ago, where we were talking about sort of our religious views and the fact that we were both non-religious. And I my opinion on it is that I'm fine with not believing in a specific deity, and I can carry my life just fine that way. And it's also okay for my mom to have that belief system as well, because that's what keeps her going. That's what makes her happy. As
Yeah.
long as she's not hurting anyone, of course, I am happy that she has that to carry her through life, and that motivates her to not only be a better person but also better herself, and it gives her sort of this motivation to enjoy life and continue on, and
Yeah.
et
A
cetera.
sense of
So
meaning and purpose and yeah.
yeah, and for some people they need that, or they want that in their lives, and that's great for them as long as no one's being hurt by it. I'm all for it, for
Yeah.
everyone having their specific things that keep them going.
Yeah. And the exploration and the questions you were, and I'm digging back into your childhood here, so it's a long way back to remember. But were your questions and challenges with your mum more about the facts and the evidence and the reason and the inconsistencies in the Bible, and this doesn't seem like it's likely to be true? Was it that type of stuff, or was it more about some of the ethical problems you hinted at? There were exclusions or conditions to this universal compassion that. I mean, for me, for one example, I guess probably the most central example that is relevant to many religions is, I just don't see how the concept of creating a hell where you would torture, many billions of essentially innocent people for eternity, how in any way that can be consistent with a compassionate God. So that was, one of the things I, as a teenager, was thinking, hold on. So there was the evidence stuff, but there was also hold on, this ethics just doesn't feel intuitively right to me. Were you questioning in both areas or more one or the other?
I think it was probably definitely both, just
Yeah.
on either side of it. It didn't really match up to me. And when you mention the creation of this place where a lot of people would suffer if they, transitioned into the afterlife, my question was, does that place even exist? How do we know that it exists? And that was sort of the way that I questioned sort of the functionality of it.
Yeah.
And then there was
Yeah.
also the exclusions that really troubled me as well, where I felt as though, and later on in life, it really came to a head for me, because I'm an individual who has managed to fall into almost every marginalized community somehow. I'm someone who is part of the LGBTQ plus community, and I'm also someone who is a minority, and et cetera. So once I had that realization that I fell into so many of those categories that potentially might be excluded from, salvation, that was something where I felt as though, well, am I a bad person for something that I can't control?
Yeah.
So there's the other thing about it that sort of made me question as well.
Yeah, you're ticking so many of the wrong boxes from a sort of conservative Christian worldview that, it sort of brings it to a pretty clear point, doesn't it? So, yeah, thank you. So, how would you describe how you think about reality and epistemology now? Are you, because some people who've moved away from a formal religion, like me, become quite a sort of boring naturalistic atheist, if you like, or probably maybe an extreme agnostic. I just think it's vanishingly unlikely there's a God. So some people follow that sort of classical path. Other people will hold on to some aspects of a supernatural worldview, and they might describe themselves as spiritual but not religious, or find some other aspect of the mystical or something that goes beyond the natural. How would you describe your worldview now? Are you a sort of boring naturalist like me, or is there still some aspect of the supernatural that just doesn't fit with Christianity in your way of thinking?
Well, I would probably say maybe some aspect of the supernatural. How was I able to get through 2 years of undercover investigations and, you know, get out and not be harmed or anything like that. So I had quite a bit of luck, and maybe it has to do with the supernatural. But also, I think, for me, I've always categorized myself as sort of agnostic because I don't know for sure. And I could be proven wrong. 50 years from now, there could be some proof that is actually factual, and it's something that I can actually interact with and see. And that could happen. And I've
Yeah.
never ruled anything out. I've never said, I know 100% unequivocally that this is true, that this is the fact, unless it's something that absolutely can't be disputed.
Yeah.
So
I really
that's
like
where I
that way
lie.
of thinking. And I'm very much an amateur philosopher, but some people say that there's almost two different sorts of naturalism. There's the naturalism that says only the natural world exists. In the supernatural world, there is no such thing. There's another naturalism which is more about the method and how we go about forming beliefs. And I think you just described it really well, which is, if there's evidence there, then then I'll believe that it's more likely. And if there isn't evidence there, then I won't. And I actually think that sort of method of naturalism is more important than whether there's the natural or the supernatural. Because I think that's the process of using evidence and reason in an honest way. We're always biased, but trying to acknowledge our biases and try and find our way through. And instead of saying, this is true and this is false, doing what you described and said, look, there's a degree of credence or probability, but if the evidence changes, I'll change my mind. And that's the heart of a naturalistic way of thinking. So I think it's entirely consistent with that to say, well, who knows, the supernatural, there might be things that could exist, a deity could exist, the magic could exist, these things could exist, but I won't believe in them until there's some decent evidence presented to me. It's an entirely coherent way of thinking. And it's nice to have that sort of humility as well, that quite often atheists and some people with a scientific worldview can come across as, more dogmatic than they should be. They're totally confident that a certain thing is the case, when actually, who knows? We should always be open to new evidence. So, thank you.
I definitely try to maintain that humility throughout my life in all types of things, because I never know. And I don't like to keep myself in sort of like an echo chamber. I know that can be difficult nowadays, especially online with social media, but I try to keep myself open to a couple of different, opinions or whatnot. And then as soon as I know that that's not true, then, I have my opinion that I can form, and it's based on fact. And that's good enough for me.
Yeah, exactly. And I think if you're only looking at evidence that supports what you want to believe, you're not doing it right. So,
Yeah, definitely.
like you say, it's sometimes tricky to break out those bubbles, but it's important too. So, yeah, thank you. Well, so that I guess closes out that sort of what's real question. I think we probably share a sort of naturalistic approach to thinking about what's real and what isn't real. But you've demonstrated brilliantly that it's quite hard to separate the what's real and the what matters questions, because I think they do tie together quite closely. And in a way, you've already started to answer this second question about what matters, because of course, there are problems within religious moral systems, and you talked about some of the exclusions and the conditionality, but you picked up that central golden rule and said, look, this really feels right to me. So is that still the essence of what matters to you and what ethics and morality mean?
Definitely. I think that just carries that holds a lot of the weight of the way that I would like the world to function.
Yeah.
And that is sort of like a motivator, or it explains the motivator that I have behind the work that I do as an animal rights advocate, as someone who has experienced my own share of trauma and hardship and suffering, and knowing at that point in time, for that kid that I was and the adult that I am now, I would like for a world where a kid who's like me would be able to live a life where they didn't have to go through those experiences. And if that is the case for that one child, that's going to have to be something that we implement, throughout the world in a variety of different cases and variety of different ways for all living beings. In my opinion, if you have that as your moral standard, then everyone else is going to fall into that, under that umbrella of doing for others what you would have done for you.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting that you've held on to that ethical core, even as you've moved away from a Christian worldview, because I guess one of the things I find frustrating about some of the religious morality is that there's almost this implication that the reason we're being compassionate isn't because we actually care about the others. Ultimately, it's because God commanded us to be compassionate. And I don't think that's how most religious people feel. I think most religious people genuinely do feel compassion. They're not doing it because they were told to, but there's still something slightly odd about, the whole point of this really is ultimately compliance with God, not a fundamental compassion. And there's stories like, Abraham and Isaac, which sort of bring that to the fore, where the implication of the message seems to me to be, if God tells you to do something really awful to someone you love, obedience to God wins. And I'm like, that doesn't feel right. So in a way, you kept that, ethical core that you learned through a Christian worldview, but you've lost this concern about whether you're doing it for, obedience to a deity. You're just doing it because of a genuine compassion and concern for others instead, which I think it makes it more powerful and more, better grounded than one you're doing just because you were told to. I don't know if that resonates at all, but
Yeah, definitely does, because I feel as though I completely connect with what you just said. The fact that people should be doing good things just because it is the good and the right thing to do, and not just because they're trying to get into some exclusive place that's heaven or
yeah,
whatnot, or
there's a
whatever it is
prize.
for other people. Yeah, or something like that. Or essentially, if you're doing it for those reasons, then you are technically still in it for yourself. And I think the world would do better if it was more of a selfless place. And I think nowadays what we're seeing is a lot of suffering is being executed on a lot of people who are vulnerable, and people, animals falling under that umbrella of the term people for me. I think a lot of these things are happening because of people acting in their own best self interests. And that's the sort of thing that I cannot identify with. So I understand that a lot of people, turn to religion to sort of guide them through either hard times, or if that's something that is really very much ingrained in their culture. That's something that is valid as well. But we also have to ask these questions, why are we doing these things that we're doing? And then when that person isn't holding themselves to that standard, what do they think of themselves? And is there sort of like a self-destructive idea or concept that arises within the being that is ascribing to that religion? And is that harmful to the individual as well? So,
Yeah,
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 there's really good questions
yeah,
to ask.
yeah. Thank you. You're clear that the golden rule and this compassion for others was a core part of the Christian worldview that you were brought up with. You've also hinted that, it was part of your own experience of suffering in difficult times, and oppression was one of the sources for that compassion. How did that ethic develop in your way of thinking, and how did it expand to include non-humans? Because I think almost everyone feels some sort of compassion, if it's not for their immediate family or certain subgroups of humans. People, everyone's got some compassion, but the critical question is who warrants it and how far does that moral scope go? And it sounds like you very early on just intuitively included sentient animals in that scope. Was it something that was there from day one, or how did it develop, and why do you think you came to that view?
It was something that was there from day one, I believe. I've always sort of had this connection with animals. And growing up in the environment that I was in, I did not see a lot of kindness that people would show me, and people meaning human animals. I would frequently be in those situations, and there was always some form of expectation there. There was the expectation that I had to do a specific thing in order to receive kindness or compassion, or the individual expected me to, fall under some guideline in order
Yeah.
to be worthy of that, right? And
So it's
those are,
transactional, and you had to sort of fit in a box and
yeah, and it's
do what you're
it's
told,
sort
and
of
yeah,
in line with, religious conditions as well, right? So that was sort of the household that I grew up in. And whenever I came across a non-human animal, I never felt that there was any expectation there. They just live, and they survive in this world, and they take it day by day. And there are no conditions to receive affection from them. It's just they automatically give it, or they might be cautious. But in most cases, I could always connect with them and experience some kind of kindness or compassion where there were no expectations there. It was just given and received in kind. And those were sort of the purest connections that I could make. And I think it just speaks to animals in general, where they have that mindset where they don't put themselves in these boxes. They're just living. They're just existing, which
Yeah.
is pretty awesome.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's almost it sometimes feels like it's the state that many humans are trying to achieve, where it's just genuine and natural and flowing, and there's not too many annoying, noisy internal voices in the background, nagging away at you. It's just a different mode of existence, and I'm sure there's we have a lot in common. I'm sure they have their own anxieties and their own worries too, but it feels like that. The way you engage with non-human animals just sets such a stark contrast against what you were finding from some of the other humans around you too. So there's that sense of reassurance and immediacy of connection and a genuine, unconditional compassion from them. And so, in your sense, was just you reciprocated that?
Yes, I clearly remember there was one point in my life when I was really young, and I was walking to school one day, and every time I'd walk by this particular house, there was a huge fence that was sort of really blocked off. You couldn't really see what was on the other side, but you could always hear a dog, and they sounded like a really big dog barking, just sounding sort of scary. But I was always really curious about who was on the other side of that fence. So one day I was walking to school, and I just happened to put my hand against the side, the fence. And instead of being mauled or something horrible happening, losing fingers, I just felt a wet nose and breathing, and just having that interaction with that individual. And I didn't feel any type of fear there. I just felt like this is someone I'm saying hello to. I've never seen them before, but I've always been curious about them. And it turns out they're not as scary and horrible as some people believed that they were. So that was something that I remember.
Yeah, I like it. And were most of your experiences with non-human animals like that? Was it neighborhood, or did you have companion animals, or did you have any experience of farms at that time? Which animals did you build relationships with?
All kinds of animals, I think. Most of the time, those who fall under the umbrella term of companion animals, cats, dogs, and I would always encounter these situations where I would be in a position to act as someone who would be a rescuer in some cases. There was this storm one day, and there were these stray kittens in a bucket, and the bucket was turned up so that the rainwater was going into it, so they would have slowly drowned to death if I hadn't run out in the thunderstorm as a little girl and taken them in. And the stray dog one time was loose in our neighborhood, and then the neighborhood kids were sort of harassing this dog, and I was the one who stepped in because I felt some type of compassion for them, and I, took them in. And that there were always these cases where I would be in the position to be sort of the rescuer, and I think that eventually influenced me to become an undercover investigator at some
We can
point.
see your path, the early steps. Yeah. And one of the big challenges, of course, in this space is food, because I think many young people would have some sort of similar experiences with non-human animals where they did develop a very natural affinity, sense of relationship, a sense of compassion. But at some point, there's a recognition of what's on the family dinner plate, and that can be something that leads to just denial or avoidance of the topic, or cognitive dissonance, or the full range of human biases and psychology and defenses come into play. They certainly did with me for many decades. So how did that aspect of your concern for non-humans play out? How early did that start to factor in, and How did you work through that transition?
Right. The first time that that happened to me was actually when I watched my first documentary that was going through sort of the food system. And that was also where undercover investigations footage was shown. And I was the first time that I saw it, I immediately felt horrified. And I always exposed myself to things like that when I was really young. Can't explain why. I still do it to this day. I expose myself to many different things that a lot of people would shy away from.
How
But I
old were
always
you?
wanted
Do
to
you,
see these
do you think
things.
when you saw the that footage for the first time?
I think I was maybe 14 or 13 years old. Um, I think that's probably the case, 13 or 14. And I just jumped right into it. And yeah, so when I did see that, I just felt horrible. And I felt like this is an awful thing that is happening. And then when I went after watching that documentary and I sat down with my family and we were eating the carcass of a chicken, I could feel like there was that contradiction there. Like, why am I eating this? Why? And eventually, and I think this happens to most people, that feeling fades away because you get back into your routine, your day to day. You don't see it anymore. And
Yeah,
and you see everything that normalizes it. And that's always at the forefront. And then your parents normalize it, or your community normalizes it. And it's not something that people think about because a lot of the time, especially for my community, there were so many other problems that were going on
yeah.
that needed more attention or something like that. So eventually for me it faded away, but I would always go back to those documentaries every time a new one came out. I would go and watch it, feel this, go through the same situation, the same feelings of guilt and horror, and feeling like I needed to do something but not really knowing exactly how to go about doing those things. And I think that's where animal advocacy organizations or vegan organizations come into play, where they give those guidelines and those step by step paths that you can take to live a different life and take up a different lifestyle that doesn't contribute to that suffering.
Yeah, yeah, and it's a difficult dynamic, but I think one we'll talk about a little bit more when we talk about the future, because the whole purpose of the industry is to try and keep that stuff hidden from us, and as consumers, we don't want to see it either generally. So it's a sort of strange situation where both sides are deliberately trying to hide the reality from each other for their own purposes. So yeah, it's strange. So what was the process? At what point did it stick for you where you stopped going back to the chicken, and where you finally made changes in your own life?
Right. This is a story that I usually tell pretty often because this is what I try to do to motivate any individuals who are sort of falling into the line of vegan activist or vegan advocate, who might be a volunteer or someone who's just vegan and existing in this world and talking to other people about it, because it is effective and it does make a difference. So the first time that it really stuck with me was because I had my first interactions with someone who was vegan, and I was talking to them, and I was telling them this is the way that I would like for the world to be one day, because I went through so much suffering and so many different experiences that were traumatic for me. And I felt like there has to be some type of alternative to that, and that's the type of world that I want to contribute to. And that's when I was challenged there by that vegan friend, and they said, okay, well, you have all of these worldviews and these opinions on the way that the world should be, but you're not vegan. And that was sort of like a call out for me, where I had always had these feelings like I should definitely be vegan because I have these reactions to the documentaries, and I have connections with the animals, but for some reason I didn't take that step. And it was more so for me, I considered it to be like a selfish thing that I just would push it back to the back of my mind. So at that point, I felt compelled to actually make a difference in my lifestyle and not contribute to that suffering. If I want to see a world where there are no people who have to be exploited or whatnot. That would be something that I would have to do as an individual to help contribute to that world. So to that future. So that was when I decided to sort of transition to vegetarianism. I kept watching the documentaries, I kept watching the investigations footage, and then I had that shift of, well, maybe I can do undercover investigations for an animal advocacy organization and contribute in that way. And I felt that was where I would be most effective. And then once the day I became an undercover investigator, that was the day that I became a vegan.
Yeah. And did you find it difficult practically or socially once you'd made that switch? Or was it
I
just,
think
I'm done, light bulb, move on?
once I made the switch to veganism, it was very easy because I was undercover and I was out in the middle of nowhere most of the time. Nobody was going to criticize me
Yeah.
for that.
Yeah.
But when I transitioned to vegetarianism, it was definitely sort of a thing that I was struggling with because I didn't really know what to eat. And I am no cook by any means. So
Yeah. Me
I
neither.
was
Yeah.
living off the bare minimum, and I would go to the supermarket. I would try to look into in the vegan aisle, and I would just grab whatever I could afford. And also the price factor was something that, for someone who is in my position economically, and as someone who was primarily most of the time living in low income communities and struggling to get by, I felt like that was sort of a really huge hurdle for me to figure out what to eat, what I could afford in order to stick and adhere to that lifestyle. And eventually, once I transitioned to veganism, I realized that there are a lot of easier ways to do that. And it doesn't always have to be sort of the things that are branded as vegan that you turn to and purchase. It can be, beans or rice or things that you eat every day anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. But you mentioned two important things there. One was the, knowing someone who's vegan and that sort of challenge and having at least someone else around you who's been on that journey to help. And the other thing is just the practical knowledge of, how to do these things. So, yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, as
So,
long as people know that, it's not as difficult as it might seem.
yeah, exactly. So we've talked about who gets to matter there, and in a short, I guess caring about all animals is a good shorthand for me. But I quite like the idea of zeroing on this idea of sentience, just because I think that's ultimately what matters. I don't care about an animal just because we've classified it as an animal. I care about them because they have the capacity to suffer, and it's that suffering and the flourishing that I care about. So is that where you'd set your boundary of compassion now? Would you say it is all animals or all sentient beings? Or what do you think about even going beyond sentience to having compassion for things that can't suffer, like plants or trees or rocks or rivers or environments or ecosystems? Because some people would criticize sentientism and say, look, you're not going far enough. You're almost discriminating against, the biosphere and ecosphere and things that don't suffer.
Yeah, I think a lot of detractors would also turn to that. Well, I mean, you're vegan, but what about all the plants, et cetera, and you're
Yeah.
killing them? And for me, I think, blocking out all the noise, I love nature and I would like for it to be preserved. I think that's really important. And I don't know, I'm a tree hugger. I go out hiking and I interact with the plant life around me. I touch the leaves. I will stop and hug a tree every now and then because I recognize that they do have this ability to try to survive. And I think every thing that is living in some capacity does do that. So for me, I think, having that importance and placing that importance on nature and plant life is something that we should be doing as a society for sure. And I think what we have to do is sort of look at what we have proven to contain sentience. That is absolutely important
Yeah.
because a lot of people, and specifically the animal agriculture industry especially, will have and try to convince people that these non-human animals do not feel any type of pain. They don't have the capacity to suffer because it's easier to think of them as products, as just food.
Yeah.
And I remember watching this one, and this is just how prevalent that mindset is throughout the world that we live in. I remember watching this series on Netflix where a comedian was walking with his daughter into a bodega, or like a corner store, and there were some live lobster in a tank. And as the comedian's walking through the little store, his daughter just points at the tank and says, somebody needs to help them. Look at them. They need to be helped, or something like that. And the comedian was just frustrated and just trying to pull his daughter along. And then eventually he stops and he says, "That's not people, that's food." And then he takes her and they continue walking. So that just goes to show like how prevalent that mindset is, and then how dangerous it is, because we're always met with these contradictions that animals do have the capacity to suffer and feel pain and feel joy and happiness and all those different things, and emotions that we normally attribute it just to ourselves. And it's really important to recognize that and to be aware and cognizant of that, and have that inform the way that we treat them as well, because you really get into some tricky situations when you're constantly telling yourself this being is not capable of feeling pain while they are screaming in pain and you're doing something to them. That's I can't even imagine being in that type of position, but a lot of people are, unfortunately,
Yeah,
in
they
this
are.
world.
They are. It's amazing. And the episode I've just released was with Mark Solms, who's done amazing work on neurology and understanding the brain. And he's absolutely clear that the basis of our sentience probably evolved 600 million years ago and is extremely widespread across the animal kingdom. Certainly all vertebrates, probably many of the invertebrates as well. And he just sees it as scientifically so well grounded that it's, we can have enormous confidence in it. But he said there are even scientists, who even study animal behavior and animal psychology, who still maintain that they can't really experience suffering in the same way as human animals can. It's genuinely bizarre. It's a sort of strange, deep-seated anthropocentric arrogance. And of course, when it comes to the animal agriculture industry, a very self-serving lie that people like to believe. And that's quite an interesting example as we come to talk about, how can we make a better future for all sentient beings. Part of my rationale behind this idea of sentientism combining both a naturalistic approach that focuses on beliefs and credence and a compassion that's grounded in sentience and a sentiocentric compassion is because I think we need both. So when many people look at the animal agriculture industries, for example, and you or I might look at that and go, look, how can that exist? Because surely it's a failure of compassion. Surely it's because humans just don't care about these billions or trillions of animals in farms and being fished. It's a failure of compassion. It's an ethical problem. And that's part of it, but that's not all of it. I think just as big a problem, maybe even bigger, is that people believe fabrications that then enable them to carry on doing what they're doing. So they will believe animals can't suffer. They will believe that farming can be humane. They can believe that animals don't grieve or aren't stressed by seeing what's happening to their family and group members. So it's a combination of false beliefs and fabrications as well as failures of compassion, and we need to address them both. But and what you laid out there was a great example of that. If people genuinely believe or kid themselves they believe that animals can't suffer, it makes their life much easier because yet again they don't need to change, and us humans love having excuses not to change.
Yeah, for sure.
So let's come on to that final, another crazily big question about how do we think about the future? Because I think, you and I roughly share a sort of naturalistic way of thinking. We share this sentiocentric compassion that we care about all sentient beings. But most humans on the planet disagree with this in some shape or form because either they hold to some sort of explicitly supernatural beliefs and their compassion. While I think most humans would say, look, I do care about animal suffering, in practical terms, it's extremely constrained. So there are many humans that constrain their compassion even within humans, and we know the horrible problems that leads to in terms of intrahuman ethics. But within the non-human animals space, it's equally as egregious in that people will care about their own companion animals and some charismatic wild animals, but will in practical terms exclude all of the other wild animals and certainly all animals in farms from practical moral consideration. So we're in this weird situation where I think, our stance seems probably quite strong and self-evident to us, but the way the world operates at the moment and the way humanity operates is very, very different. So how does that leave you thinking about what sort of future we might be able to get to and how can we get there? And you can talk about intrahuman ethics. Of course, the focus of your work is on the horrific problem of animal agriculture as well, so we can spend some time there. But how do you think in general terms about what a better future might look like and how we can get there?
Right. Well, I think a lot of it has to do with the way that we attempt to understand other people's journey, to really sort of separating themselves from all the propaganda that they've had to listen to throughout their entire lives. And that stems from religious, context where, I mean, for my aunt, when I told her about the things that I had witnessed as an undercover investigator, and I told her all these things after the fact, when she was aware of all of that information, her counter to that was, well, it doesn't say in the Bible, for the Christian Bible, that man has dominion over animals. And that was something that she brought up. So that's in the religious context. And then, like I explained earlier, we have the advertisements, the general culture within our society that says that it is okay to consume animals because they're, food, or they are objects, and you don't really need to feel compassion for them because they're serving, the purpose of feeding the more dominant population on the planet, right?
The
And
apex
then you
predator.
have right. My counter to that is that, okay, let's see how the apex predator does one-on-one with an actual apex predator with
Yeah.
no tools, no nothing. I don't
Yeah.
think that would go very well.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, there's that, and then there's also the lies that are put forth by the animal agriculture industry that profits from all of these beliefs that people may have. And you have all of this that people have to fight against to break out of. And then you have the culture as well within their community, within their, family unit, their family structure. So you have all of these ways that people are influenced. And you have to understand that it can be really hard for people to break out of that. But the best thing that we can do is have that understanding, but also don't, compromise as well. And to absolutely, stay strong in your stance on what your belief is, because that's what these non-human animals are sort of relying upon and waiting for us to do, right? I think that for me personally, I feel as though they are the animals that I've come across are incredibly just these resilient beings that I would not be able to endure what they endure on a daily basis, but they do. And somehow they continue to survive day after day in the conditions that they're in and with the exploitation that they experience. And I feel as though they are waiting for us as, human animals to come to that conclusion, to come to that realization that this is wrong and we shouldn't be doing these things to them. And that requires a lot of, back and forth conversations. That requires a lot of organizations to be working towards this common goal of however we go about doing this. But it's really a way of deep. It's a matter of deep programming a lot
Yeah.
of the population to sort of break out of that mindset. And there are a variety of different ways that we have to do that. But I think at the basis of it, it is that understanding of why people do the things that they do, why they have this essential belief system, and how can we support their transition away from that. And I think that's something that we at Animal Outlook have sort of honed in on with our farm transitions program as well. That we recognize that there are farmers who this is their livelihood, so that is why they are locked in, and that is why they are contributing to the suffering of these living beings, where sometimes they don't want to do that and they don't have a way to get out of it. So it's up to us who are already have broken out of that mindset to be able to recognize that there's some people who are still stuck in it, how can we support them from breaking out of it? And it requires a lot of work and a lot of time and a lot of effort. But I think in the end, it is worth it to sort of support everyone and lift everyone up and fight against, a lot of these corporations and other people who are profiting off of that exploitation, to say, we're doing the work that we need to do to make this world a better place, regardless of whether you're okay with, destroying it in the process of what you're doing.
Yeah. And there's a lot of focus, obviously, on the consumers, who are taking decisions to buy the products from these industries for understandable reasons, because, putting the subsidies to one side, that's frankly where the money comes from these industries, is largely from individual consumers. So there's a lot of focus on, as you said, that sort of de-indoctrination process of understanding all these powerful cultural and social and psychological forces that have led people to think this is normal, and because it's normal, it must be okay, right? So let's carry on. So that's a really interesting area of focus. But as you said, I think it's also really interesting to look at the industry itself, and the firms and the organizations and the farms and the people who run those farms and the people who work on those farms too. And I'd love to dig into that idea about the transition part, because I think it's been neglected in the animal advocacy and vegan movements overall historically. I think there's been such a focus on persuading the consumer to change, which is still important, but there hasn't been enough focus on looking at the anatomy of the industries themselves and working out how to change in ways that also show compassion to the people whose lives are tied up with them too. But before we come on to the transition idea, what role do you think investigations and your amazing work can play in both nudging the industry in a particular direction and also shifting consumer and wider cultural thinking about animal agriculture? And what's your experience of the reaction to the things you've uncovered?
Oh, usually the experiences that either that they, it's always, it always happens, I think, twofold. And on one hand, people are horrified by it and they feel guilty for participating in it, and they try to figure out what they can do in order to not contribute to that. And then on the other hand, there are people who believe that, or think that it's faked, or that it's, edited in some way.
Or it's a
And
bad apple, it's just a rare...
yeah, and for the editing part, I am floored by the people who believe that these places would allow anyone to walk onto the property and just fabricate something on their property. I don't think people would really do that. So it's always absurd when that argument is brought up. But in terms of just the bad apple thing, I think that's also someone who is, if they do make that excuse, that's someone who's really locked in and they don't want to feel like there's nothing else, there's no alternative, because that's what they feel in that moment. If there are no just bad apples, there aren't just singular farms that are awful, what do they do? And that's something that they've done for their entire lives. They've consumed animals, and that's what their parents did before them and their parents' parents, and et cetera. And what do they do? Like, how do they feed their children? And I think that's something that we really have to focus on as well, is that, some people are in positions where they have to, struggle with that, cognitive dissonance, and we have to be mindful of that. But when it comes to investigations in particular, I believe that they are powerful because they make people ask these questions, right? They make people ask whether there are some good farms, and then they're open to receiving that information that no, there aren't, because of these variety of different factors. And number one being that every farm is exploiting an animal, regardless of how large it is, how small it is, whether it's organic or non-organic, et cetera. So that opens up the ability to make these conversations and have these conversations with people. And then on the other hand, it does hold the industry accountable in many cases as well. And when it comes to just how that footage interacts with the industry as a whole, I think it challenges a lot of the notions and the propaganda, in my opinion. That's what it is, that is put out and put forth by the industry. where there's that picture of the happy animal grazing on a green pasture, and that's what's placed on the labels. And they don't have to say it explicitly, but that's what's in the advertisements. That's what's on the labels in the supermarkets. And that's the idea that they're putting forth for people to believe in. And for people who have never been at these places and they've never grown up in those types of environments, or if they have, they see just all the best parts of it. If they're people who grew up on farms and worked alongside their family, those are the memories that they have that are tied to sort of the behaviors that they're practicing and the mistreatment that the animals have to go through. That's something that falls by the wayside. So when it comes to investigations footage, it just completely flips it on its head, because it's what happens when no one's watching, and when these places think that no one's watching. And that's where people are at their most natural. They're going to do the things that they do all the time, because there's that expectation that, they can get away with it because it's hidden behind those closed doors. And once investigations blows those doors wide open, the industry then turns and says, that's just the one farm. But how many times can they say that? There's been so many different investigations where all of this cruelty and all of the mistreatment that the animals have to endure is revealed. And every single time they have the same excuse. I mean, in my opinion, maybe one day they switch it up, but at this point, people have to begin to question, okay, well, if that's the same thing every time, and that's just one farm, if we look at the body of work of investigations, that adds up to a lot of farms. So eventually that's not going to be a thing that they can turn to. And the more that we have these investigations that happen, the more that we can disprove that theory that this is something that is okay. Because all the time, every single time an investigation comes out, people realize it, and then the proof is in the visuals and the audio, that this is not okay, and it's something that we have to definitely move away from if we're going to progress as a society.
Yeah, that transparency is absolutely critical. And I've got so much respect for the work that you and other investigators do, because most consumers don't want to go into these places because they just don't want to know. Most people who have genuine compassion for the victims don't want to go into these places because it's horrific to experience those things just through a basic human empathy. And you made enormous sacrifices at being willing to break through that door and put yourself through some terrible situations, bearing witness to those victims being harmed for the good of those victims. It warrants enormous respect. And when you've been in those situations, how do you come to feel about the other people who are working in those farms? Is there a sense that these are ordinary people just doing what the industry does? Are there other instances where it's explicitly some form of sadistic cruelty? And how do you feel about the other people working in these environments? Do you see them as perpetrators? Do you see them as also being victims in some sense of the system? How do you think about the other humans in these environments?
Right. Well, in my opinion, you could definitely be a victim and a perpetrator.
Yeah.
They can definitely, go hand in hand, depending on the situation, depending on the individual. And I think most of the time that might be the case, right? Because when I look at sort of the perpetrator aspect of it, I look at what environment is being cultivated to allow that behavior to be something that is accepted, right? So if you have an industry that is cultivating an environment that they have these workers who are in these positions and they're constantly being told, you need to move these units in an efficient manner, and they need to be processed quickly because we have to meet the demands of these consumers and make more money. Obviously, they don't say it in those terms, but essentially, yeah, they're considered, when it comes to referring to them as units of production, that is how they're considered in black and white terms within the industry. So if you have this environment where, that is sort of the mindset and the mentality, and then you insert the standard practice aspect into it, whereas you have normal farming procedures that are done by these workers where they are inflicting pain on these animals anyway, whether it be at a pig farm where they're forced to sort of to mutilate these piglets, these newborn piglets, cutting off their tails, docking their tails, cutting parts of their ears off, and then castrating them without any pain relief. Or if you have dairy farms where they're dehorning or disbudding these young calves that are almost newborn, and they're taking hot irons and then they're pressing it into their skulls, and that's a normal practice where
Yeah,
they're
that is the
causing these
standard,
animals
right?
pain.
Yeah.
Right. If that's sort of the culture that is being established by the industry, then when you're looking at the perpetrators who are going outside of the standard practice by chance and they happen to perform an act of cruelty towards one of these animals, you have to ask, okay, well, where's the line? Because they're causing them pain anyway, and that is the culture of the industry. So, are they just doing this because they want to, or are they doing it because they're in an environment that permits them to just exhibit all the worst parts of human behavior, right? And if you're in that type of situation, then it's normalized and it's considered okay.
And I wonder if that's part of what goes on in people's minds, is they're thinking, if I'm, if the process and what I'm expected to do and what is in my job description is to castrate this piglet without pain relief, if that is normal and expected and standard, then why wouldn't stabbing a cow with a pitchfork also be normal? If I'm consistent, how can I condemn one of those things and not the other? It's sort of horrible warped sense. It almost makes sense because that normalization, as you say, comes from the standard aspects of the process, but then applies across all sorts of other awful behaviors as well. I wonder if that's something that's going on in psychology too.
Yeah, it's really sort of sickening, the indoctrination that happens
Yeah.
in farms where you have these individuals who have to sort of numb themselves to the screams of these animals, the screams of the piglets. They're processing piglets. They might process 100 piglets a day, who knows, depending on the size of the farm. And every single time, every single piglet is screaming. And if you do that for 5 years, every single day, 100 piglets, then you can only imagine how you have to sort of fight back against that better nature that tells you that this individual is a living being and they're screaming right in my hands, but the the way that the work flows, I have to just keep going.
Yeah.
So that is
Yeah.
sort of what happens in that type of environment. So whenever anyone asks or wonders how I feel about the workers, specifically as individuals who I might have documented in some cases committing acts of cruelty towards the animals, I always answer with this type of thing because that's where our focuses need to lie.
Yeah.
You need to focus on what, because the workers aren't cultivating this type of environment. So who is?
Yeah.
And whoever is needs to be held accountable because essentially we're having these individuals who would, outside of that context, might be able to form some type of notion that, okay, if I cause this animal pain, then they're definitely feeling it. If they're screaming, they're vocalizing, they're definitely feeling it. So maybe that's wrong. And putting them in an environment that says, no, that's actually okay. And it's okay because we have to make money off of this. And then also we have to put out this product to consumers who will pay us. And then
Yeah.
we keep making money off of it. So that's where I always, put my attention on because I think that's we should definitely be looking at the industry and just the toxic nature of it in many ways
Yeah.
that needs to be addressed.
Yeah, thank you. And it would be good to spend, if you've got a little bit more time, to talk about the transition idea, because I think that's practically deeply important, but it's also a sort of emotionally impressive thing to do, because by definition, we're looking at this thing that we think is horrific and still recognizing that, as you say, even the perpetrators are themselves victims, and we need to have compassion for the people in these systems as well. So I think this transition space is super important. And historically has been neglected. So I'd love to know a little bit more about how you think about transition, partly because sometimes it's the thinking around it can be a little bit naive and wishful thinking on the animal advocate side too. It can be just, why doesn't the rancher just, transition to being a sanctuary and start growing hemp and then all the problems are solved. And it, my amateur understanding of it, it's not quite that simple. So how do you think about the transition space and how much progress we can realistically make there and how best to make that happen?
I think it's definitely a step in the right direction, and especially with testimonials from workers or farm managers, farm owners that might be contracted to a particular animal agriculture industry corporation that have expressed in some cases it seems like they're in a position of being in indentured servitude.
Yeah.
So they're constantly in debt and there's never a way to dig themselves out of it. And
Locked into
it's
contracts.
just, yeah, definitely. And then they're working with these living beings that they have to manipulate their weight. They have to manipulate, you know, and put them in environments where they're going to get sick, they're going to get injured, they're going to be born with some type of deformities or whatnot, and have to just have them in this environment where they're not, you know, thriving. They're maybe surviving, and they have to, you know, try to make them survive long enough for them to be slaughtered, and then to have all these other things that they have to worry about. It's just, it's again a very toxic way of, you know, making a living.
Yeah.
And a lot of farmers have expressed that they feel like they are being taken advantage of. They feel like they are contributing to this type of suffering because, again, another thing that I like to point out as someone who did undercover investigations and interacted with these workers and these farm managers on a daily basis, they see these animals every single day and they interact with them every single day. So a lot of the time they can form some connections with them, and they also can express some type of remorse. And we have heard, you know, stories from farmers who actually feel bad when they have to put down an animal or they have to euthanize an animal, especially on dairy farms, I think, because the animals are a lot larger and they and cows have these really amazing, beautiful personalities. So some farmers do feel remorse when they feel like they're in a position where they have to euthanize an animal due to whatever happened to that animal in the conditions that they're in. So you have all these stories about how these farmers actually can connect to the animals, but then that connection has to be cut off in a way because they have to profit, right? So it's so sad. I remember at the aquaculture facility I investigated, and on the last day of the time where I documented these workers throwing fish across the way and throwing fish into tanks and throwing them up in the air and letting them fall down to the concrete ground underneath us over and over and repeatedly, just doing the most, you know, horrible things to these animals. And then at the end of the workday, the farm manager turns to me and he says, you know, it used to bum me out the way that we kill them because they would just put the fish into empty buckets with no water inside of the buckets and then just let them suffocate to death. And he said it's just because they suffocate, it's really rough, but over the years you kind of get desensitized. So the desensitization aspect of it is really prominent as well. And we have to look at all of these things when it comes to, you know, farmers in general and how they interact with these animals and how tied they are to the livelihoods. So whenever an alternative can be offered, that's wonderful for a lot of these individuals who might have these alternative points of view that differ from what the industry tries to drill into their minds, and they actually have a way out, which is something that a lot of farmers think that they don't have the ability to do anything else, or even farm workers in some cases. So, our farm transitions program, I think, as I said, is a step definitely in the right direction to offer an alternative to a lot of these individuals who might otherwise not do this type of thing if they had another thing to do. And so instead of farming animals, farming plants, that's definitely something that has way less stressors, I think, for their mentality, their mental health, their physical health, and maybe even their financial health as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. And I find it interesting in the consumer space and in the industry in that the norms and the desensitization and the, you know, I guess the social norms are so powerful and insidious and extremely hard to break. So that, I find frustrating and difficult to deal with. But at the same time, those norms are obscuring the fact that I think many people sort of, at least in theory, agree with us already. So most consumers don't really like causing needless suffering and death to farmed animals. And many of the people involved in the industry don't really want to be there doing those things either. It's just the way things are. And in both cases, that's why I think it's so powerful to then offer alternatives, because it's easy to stand outside and moralize and say, we don't care, shut it down, you're perpetrators, you deserve to be punished, right? And sometimes, that's the stereotype of the angry vegan on Twitter, and I am one sometimes, which is just understandably so horrified by this whole thing that we just want to condemn the entire enterprise. And I understand that, and I feel it too. But in practical terms, and also in compassionate terms, we need to have compassion for the people who are involved in these systems, indoctrinated to these systems. We should have compassion for them too, even as they cause harm. And in practical terms, we need to help them find alternatives. And whether that's for consumers, fortunately they have an alternative, plants, but of course, there's all sorts of innovation going into alternatives that get really close to the quality and the feel and the experience of animal products. That at least practically helps people find a path to behaving more in line with their maybe latent ethic anyway. And I think the same is true of the transition programs in animal agriculture, because you can actually provide a practical, supported way of these communities, these businesses, and these farmers and these employers shifting towards something that probably they'll be happier with anyway. And the more we can help that happen, the better. And how hopeful do you feel that, because my sense of the transition programs at the moment, because Animal Outlook, you run one, there's Mercy for Animals, there's some work being done, stock-free work being done in Scotland and Sweden. So there's a few different programs around the world. I think Miyoko's Creamery do another as well. They feel at the moment very much like pilots. They're exploratory. The rancher advocacy program is another one as well, of course, RAP. But they feel very exploratory and pilots, and we're learning, and it's a few farms here and there. What's your sense about whether and how we can get those to scale?
I think it will take a lot of time. And I think even though it will take time, we're definitely committed to continuing to put our efforts into it, because any good thing might take a really long time to build up. And I think that's true of veganism. I think that's true of animal rights. And it's also going to be true for farm transitions, most likely. But it's something that has never really been offered before in this type of capacity. So it's new, it's innovative, and it is 100% rooted in compassion on both sides of the aisle, right? It's not just for the animals, it's also for these human animals who are locked into these worlds that they want to break away from. So the fact that we are offering for them to be able to do that, I think for me personally, I completely identify with that, because a lot of the farm workers that I interacted with shared a lot of the same culture that I do, had a lot of the same background that I do, because I am a descendant of immigrants as well, and a lot of those farm workers will be immigrants as well, and Hispanic, identifying and having that Hispanic background. So
Yeah.
that's something that I was able to share the same language with these individuals, and I was able to talk with them, chat with them, and in some cases they feel like they have no other alternatives. So the fact that there are alternatives out there that aren't exploitative as
Yeah.
well, it's just showing the world that there is a better way, there's a better path forward, and it's just a matter of getting the messaging out there, for one, which I think is a little easier to do in the world that we live in today, because a lot of things can go viral or be promoted on social media, and that's something that a lot of people do have access to. So there's that, and there's also just it is going to take some time. It is going to take time to sort of have people break away from that mindset, but we're putting forth that idea and that concept that we want a better future, and animal rights and veganism and the way that it sort of intersects with everything is evident, and we recognize that, and we want a better future for all, and we include animals in that because they are one of the more exploited individuals in this world that we live in. But we do recognize that veganism and animal rights sort of touches upon a lot of these other different issues, and we're just trying to tackle that. And farm transitions is one of the ways that we try to do that.
Yeah, completely. And you mentioned earlier on that one of the challenges put to you was this sense of, why focus on the non-human animal issues, because, our communities have got so many of their own issues within our own species already. And as you hinted at there, I think there's a complementarity. We can work to transition these extremely harmful exploitative issues, and it'll be good for the humans too. I mean, is that your sense? How do you think of those intersections and the human ethical challenges and the non-human challenges set together or against each other?
Yeah, well, I think what I shared about my background sort of speaks to that, and the way that I identify as an individual, and then also, my heritage, my culture, and all of that just goes into that mindset that I have for wanting a better future for everyone. And for me, the most effective way to pursue that better world is through animal rights work, because it is, in my opinion, an everything issue. It's like an everything bagel. It has everything on it. It can be an animal rights issue, a human rights issue, a workers' rights issue, human health issue, environmental issue, and that is a fact. And there are studies to prove it. And it's just something that, for me, it encompasses so much and it touches upon so many different issues that is where I think I can be most effective towards being one of those individuals who tries to contribute to that better future for people who come from the types of backgrounds that I came from, where I experienced a lot of suffering in my life. And I want to create a world where there are other individuals who don't have to go through that, whether they be human animals or non-human animals.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you. And your work has been so central to pushing that agenda forward. I completely agree. It's just such an obvious, clear win-win-win, and it's a deeply important lever to pull. So, yeah, thank you. Is there anything else you'd like to add into the conversation? It feels like we've answered what's real, what and who matters, and how to make a better future in an hour, 20 minutes. But is there anything else you'd like to add in that we haven't covered already?
I think we've really had a really interesting and engaging conversation here, and I'm really glad that you had me on. And I really appreciate the opportunity to sort of touch upon these issues. I think the only thing left that I'd say is that for anyone who's interested in learning more about our farm transitions program, you can go to animaloutlook.org, and we actually have all the information that you need on our website. And then we're also active on social media, on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, even TikTok, where we're under the handle Animal Outlook.
That's great. My kids have banned me from doing Sentientism TikTok, but we'll see. I don't think they can handle the embarrassment. But that's brilliant. Thank you. Do you do any social media personally yourself, or is it mostly you're sending people to Animal Outlook?
I do. I'm actually active sort of on Twitter, as I try to figure it out still.
Yeah.
Instagram, just under my name, Erin Wing, and Facebook as well. And I am very sort of like a master of none for all of those platforms. So don't expect too much if you're visiting any of those pages, but
No, that's
they're
great.
there, and
Yeah.
I'd be happy to interact with anyone.
That's great. Thank you. Well, I'll include links in the show notes so people can click and follow your inspirational work. So, yeah, thank you. And that's my only closing thought, really. I think your work has been so groundbreaking, and I couldn't do the work you've done. I think it's distinctive, so important, and absolutely essential. And yeah, I wish you all the best on the farm transition work going forward. It's going to be as important. So, yeah, it's been a real pleasure to talk to you. Thank you for being a guest on Sentientist Conversations.
Thank you.